The end of World War II also saw the dissolution of the League of Nations. It was superseded with the formation of the United Nations in 1945.
The Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world.
How did the dissolution of the League of Nations and the formation of the United Nations affect the rights of the Jewish people under international law?
I want to turn to a final resolution of the Assembly of the League, which was adopted in April 17, 1946, at a time when the United Nations had already been established. And it's important to note these words, that the leaders of the League of Nations stipulate that those who take over must continue to administer the mandates for the well-being and development of the peoples concerned, in accordance with the obligations contained in the mandates. It means that when the United Nations, the new international organization, is established and begins to deal with issues arising out of the mandates, it must abide by the principles, by the rights, by the obligations set out in these mandates. In fact, Article 80 of the UN Charter, which is an international treaty, which is a source of rights and obligations, specifies that all of the rights given to any people prior to the execution and ratification of the UN Charter are to be protected, observed, and honored.
Article 80 of the UN Charter assumes the powers that were given to the League of Nations, so that anything that was decided under the League of Nations, such as the San Remo resolution, such as the mandate for Palestine, are still legally binding under the UN Charter.
In the aftermath of World War II, the overwhelming majority of the hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees in Europe who had survived Auschwitz and the other death camps wanted just one thing: to return to their ancestral homeland in what was then known as Palestine. But the British government, contrary to the terms of the mandate she had signed up to in 1922, kept the doors of what had been designated under international law as the Jewish homeland firmly closed.
In 1945, especially after the elections in England, and when the Labour came to power and Bevin was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, all of a sudden they decided in a very drastic way, in a very cruel way, they stopped any immigration of the Jews from Europe who had nowhere to go. And because after the war, they had nowhere to go, and they did not want to go to the places that all their families have been exterminated. And the only place that would receive them was here in Palestine. But somehow the British Navy was opposing these miserable refugees who came from Europe. Then it became clear to us that we have to face the worst. And this is actually what happened.
Many of the hundreds of thousands of Jews who had survived the Nazi death camps now found themselves interned in displaced persons camps run by the occupying British and American military forces in Europe. Across the Atlantic in the United States, Britain came under increasing condemnation for its inhumanity to the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust.
In the summer of 1945, President Truman sent to Europe the dean of the law school at the University of Pennsylvania, Earl Harrison, to conduct a tour of the displaced persons camps. And Harrison reported back to President Truman that the United States Army was doing the exact same thing to the Jewish population in Europe as the Nazis had been doing, except, quote, we do not slaughter them.
President Truman's response was swift and decisive. He demanded that the British government immediately allow at least 100,000 of the Holocaust survivors to settle in Palestine. Prime Minister Attlee responded by reiterating the policy of the White Paper of 1939.
Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin reacted negatively to President Truman's request, but offered to the United States the opportunity to team up with Britain in the form of a commission of inquiry to examine two issues: the short-term plight of the surviving Jews in Europe and the longer-term issue about the future of Palestine. That became the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, which began its proceedings taking evidence from a variety of witnesses in Washington, D.C. in January of 1946, in London, in Cairo, eventually ending up in Jerusalem, where the committee conducted several weeks of hearings, taking testimony from Arab witnesses, from Jewish witnesses, and then finally the 12 members of this joint U.S.-British committee ending up in Lausanne, Switzerland at the Beau Rivage Hotel to deliberate as a court to try to come up with a verdict. And after 3 weeks of deliberations, very, very surprisingly, because the committee was quite divided throughout the hearings, but very surprisingly, at the end of their deliberations, the 12-member committee, 6 Americans, 6 Britons, issued a unanimous report, a unanimous verdict, if you will. And one of the most stunning conclusions that they reached was that the White Paper of 17 May 1939, in fact, breached international law. It violated Britain's obligations and Britain's requirements under the Palestine Mandate to facilitate Jewish immigration and land acquisition. That the clampdown on Jewish immigration, the severe limitation on Jewish immigration embodied in the White Paper was illegal. That the restrictions on Jewish land acquisition were illegal. And that verdict, that unanimous verdict of the Anglo-American Committee was quite stunning, quite shocking to the British government, that it was rebuked by its own members of the committee, led by Justice Sir John Singleton of the King's Bench Division in London, several other very eminent Britons on that committee, Richard Crossman, a member of Parliament, and others. In addition, the committee also agreed with President Truman that Britain should open the gates of Palestine to those 100,000 Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. And so this became a very, very significant rebuke of British policy, British anti-Zionist policy that had been embodied in the White Paper of 1939.
Despite the verdict of the 1946 Anglo-American Committee, led by 2 senior judges, one British and one American, the British government ignored it and continued its cruel and illegal policy of denying Jewish refugees entry into their historic homeland. Today, some 8 decades after the Second World War, the British government lives in denial of the illegality of its policies and its tragic consequences for the Jewish people. In the next episode of Whose Land, we continue to expose Britain's comprehensive betrayal of the Mandate and of the Jewish people.